The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as David Chen stared at his paycheck stub, the numbers swimming before his eyes like a cruel mirage. 3 months ago, his salary had been cut by 40% without warning, without explanation, and without so much as a courtesy meeting. The boss had simply issued a company-wide memo citing restructuring needs, but David knew the truth. He was being pushed out. What happened next would leave HR scrambling to contain a situation that spiraled far beyond anyone's imagination. The morning rain pelted against the windows of Nexus Technologies as David sat in his cramped cubicle, surrounded by the quiet desperation that seemed to permeate the entire accounting department. The coffee in his thermos had gone cold hours ago, but he couldn't afford the luxury of buying fresh cups from the breakroom machine anymore. Every dollar mattered now. "Hey, Dave," whispered his colleague Amy Rodriguez, leaning over the partition that separated their workstations. Her voice carried the careful tone people used when discussing terminal illnesses or family tragedies. "How are you holding up?" David managed a weak smile. "One day at a time, Amy. One day at a time." The truth was far more complicated. David had been with Nexus for 8 years, climbing from junior accountant to senior financial analyst. He'd missed his daughter's school plays, worked through weekends, and even postponed his honeymoon to meet critical deadlines. All of that loyalty had evaporated the moment Richard Blackstone, the company's ruthless CEO, decided David's department was expendable. The salary cut wasn't random, it was strategic. Blackstone knew that slashing pay would force the dead weight to quit voluntarily, saving the company from paying unemployment benefits. What he hadn't counted on was David's stubborn refusal to abandon ship. "David Chen, to conference room B, please," crackled the intercom, cutting through the ambient noise of keyboards and hushed conversations. Amy shot him a worried look as he straightened his tie and walked toward what felt like an execution chamber. Conference room B smelled of stale coffee and broken dreams. Blackstone sat at the head of the polished oak table, his silver hair slicked back and his cold blue eyes fixed on a stack of papers. Beside him sat Gloria Martinez, the head of HR, her expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. "David, take a seat," Blackstone said without looking up. His voice carried the casual indifference of a man who crushed dreams before his morning bagel. "We need to discuss your performance metrics." David's hands trembled slightly as he pulled out the metal chair, its legs scraping against the linoleum floor. "My performance has been exemplary for 8 years, Mr. Blackstone. My quarterly reports speak for themselves." "That was then," Blackstone replied, finally lifting his gaze. "This is now. The market has changed, and frankly, so have our expectations. Your current productivity doesn't justify your compensation package." The words hit David like physical blows. He'd been expecting this conversation for months, but hearing it spoken aloud made his chest tighten with a mixture of rage and desperation. "Sir, with respect, my productivity hasn't changed. If anything, I've been working longer hours since the salary reduction." Gloria Martinez cleared her throat, a sound that somehow managed to convey both sympathy and corporate coldness. "David, we appreciate your dedication, but Mr. Blackstone is right. We need to align expectations with current market conditions." "Market conditions," David repeated, the phrase tasting bitter on his tongue. "Is that what we're calling it when you cut someone's pay to force them out?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Blackstone's eyes narrowed, and for a moment David saw something dangerous flicker beneath the surface of his polished demeanor. "I'd be very careful about the accusations you make, Mr. Chen," Blackstone said, his voice low and threatening. "Insubordination won't improve your situation." David felt something snap inside him, not break, but transform. 8 years of loyalty, of sacrificing time with his family, of believing that hard work would be rewarded, crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. He wasn't going to roll over and die quietly. "I'm not making accusations, Mr. Blackstone. I'm stating facts. And the fact is, I'm not going anywhere. The next few weeks passed in a blur of hostile tension and silent warfare. David arrived early, stayed late, and documented everything with the methodical precision that had made him such a valuable employee. He began to notice patterns in the company's financial records that had previously escaped his attention, discrepancies that made his analytical mind itch with curiosity. Amy became his closest ally, sharing information from the various departments and keeping him informed about office gossip. It was through her that he learned about the others, employees across different divisions who had suffered similar salary cuts, all of them long-term workers who knew the company's operations inside and out. "It's not just you, Dave," Amy whispered during one of their clandestine coffee break meetings in the stairwell. "Marketing lost 3 people last month, and I heard from Janet in procurement that they're targeting anyone who's been here more than 5 years. That doesn't make sense from a business perspective," David replied, his mind racing through the implications. "We're the ones with institutional knowledge. We're the ones who know which suppliers are reliable, which processes actually work." "Unless," Amy said, her voice dropping even lower, "they're planning something bigger, something that requires different expertise." That night, David sat in his small apartment, surrounded by years of financial documents he'd taken home for review. His wife, Susan, had taken their daughter to her mother's house for the week, a diplomatic way of avoiding the tension that had settled over their marriage like a thick fog. He couldn't blame her. The stress of the salary cut had changed him, made him irritable and distant. As he pored over the records, patterns began to emerge like constellations in a dark sky. Unusual payments to shell companies, mysterious consulting fees, and a complex web of financial transactions that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate. David's hands began to shake as the magnitude of what he was discovering became clear. Nexus Technologies wasn't just cutting salaries to save money. They were systematically removing employees who might ask uncomfortable questions about where the money was actually going. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. For 8 years, he'd been helping to manage the books for a company that was engaged in large-scale financial fraud. The loyal employee in him wanted to deny it, to find innocent explanations for the discrepancies. But the trained accountant in him knew fraud when he saw it. David spent the weekend in a state of fevered activity, cross-referencing documents, building timelines, and constructing an airtight case that would expose the corruption at Nexus Technologies. By Sunday evening, he had assembled a portfolio of evidence that would make any prosecutor salivate. But as he sat in his kitchen, staring at the manila folder that contained his findings, David realized he was facing the most difficult decision of his life. Exposing the fraud would almost certainly cost him his job, but staying silent made him complicit in the very corruption that had destroyed his faith in the company. The sound of his phone buzzing broke through his thoughts. A text message from Amy. "Emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Blackstone called all department heads in early." Something big is happening. David's blood ran cold. Had they discovered his investigation? Were they about to make their move before he could expose them? He looked at the folder again, its contents representing months of his life and potentially the key to saving dozens of other employees from the same fate he'd suffered. Monday morning arrived grey and cold, with the kind of drizzle that made the entire city look like a watercolor painting left in the rain. David arrived at the office an hour early, the folder hidden in his briefcase like contraband. The building felt different somehow, charged with an electric tension that made his skin crawl. Amy was already at her desk when he arrived, her face pale and drawn. "Dave, we need to talk," she whispered urgently. "I found out what the meeting's about." They met in the supply closet, surrounded by boxes of printer paper and the industrial smell of cleaning supplies. Amy's hands were shaking as she spoke. "They're announcing layoffs," she said. "Massive ones. 50% of the workforce, effective immediately. All the people who got salary cuts are on the list." David felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "When?" "This afternoon. After the department head meeting, security will escort people out. No time to clean out desks or say goodbye. The corporate execution he'd been expecting was finally here, but knowing it was coming didn't make it any less devastating. David thought about his mortgage, his daughter's college fund, the life he'd built over 8 years of dedicated service. "There's more," Amy continued, her voice barely audible. "I overheard Gloria on a phone call yesterday. Something about new contracts, about bringing in fresh talent at reduced rates. They're not just cutting costs, Dave. They're replacing us entirely." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. The salary cuts, the hostile environment, the systematic targeting of long-term employees. It was all part of a coordinated plan to gut the company of anyone who might question the new direction. David gripped his briefcase tighter, feeling the weight of the evidence inside. "Amy, I need you to do something for me. If I don't make it through today, I need you to call this number." He handed her a business card for a federal investigator he'd contacted over the weekend. "Tell them about the documents in my desk drawer, the ones in the locked filing cabinet." "What are you going to do?" Amy asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. "What I should have done 3 months ago," David replied. "I'm going to fight back." The morning crawled by with agonizing slowness. David tried to focus on routine tasks, but his mind kept drifting to the confrontation that lay ahead. At exactly 11:30 a.m., the intercom crackled to life with Gloria Martinez's voice. "All employees, please report to the main conference room for an important company announcement." The conference room had been transformed into something resembling a funeral parlor. Blackstone stood at the front, flanked by security guards and several people David didn't recognize. Consultants, probably, brought in to oversee the carnage. The entire workforce of Nexus Technologies crowded into the space, their faces reflecting various degrees of anxiety and resignation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackstone began, his voice carrying the false sympathy of a politician at a disaster site. "As you know, our industry is experiencing unprecedented challenges. Market conditions have forced us to make some difficult decisions about our future direction." David felt his heart hammering against his ribs as Blackstone continued his prepared speech, dancing around the brutal reality with corporate euphemisms and meaningless buzzwords. He thought about Susan and their daughter Emma, about the mortgage payments and the dreams they'd built together. "Effective immediately," Blackstone announced, "we will be implementing a comprehensive restructuring plan that will affect approximately half of our current workforce. Those affected will receive notification within the next hour." The room erupted in shocked murmurs and whispered conversations. David saw the fear in his colleagues' eyes, the same fear that had been eating away at him for months. But alongside the fear, he also saw something else. Anger. It was time. David stood up slowly, the screech of his chair against the floor, cutting through the ambient noise like a knife. All eyes turned toward him, including Blackstone's cold blue stare. "Mr. Blackstone," David said, his voice surprisingly steady, "before you continue with your restructuring announcement, I think everyone here deserves to know the real reason behind these layoffs." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Gloria Martinez half rose from her chair, her face a mask of panic, while Blackstone's expression shifted from surprise to fury. "Mr. Chen, you're out of order. Please sit down." "I'm afraid I can't do that, sir." David opened his briefcase and pulled out the manila folder, holding it up for everyone to see. "You see, I've spent the last few months investigating some irregularities in our financial records. Irregularities that suggest this company has been engaged in systematic fraud for the past 3 years." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Employees began talking all at once, their voices rising in a cacophony of confusion and disbelief. Blackstone's face had turned an alarming shade of red, and he was making urgent hand signals to the security guards. "That's enough!" Blackstone shouted, his composure finally cracking. "Security! Escort Mr. Chen from the building immediately." But David was ready for this moment. As the guards moved toward him, he pulled out his phone and held it up. "I'm currently live streaming this to the State Attorney General's office," he announced. "Any attempt to silence me or confiscate this evidence will be recorded and submitted as part of my formal complaint." It was a bluff. He wasn't actually live streaming, but it worked. The security guards hesitated, looking to Blackstone for guidance. The CEO's face was now pale as paper, all his corporate confidence evaporating like morning mist. "You have no idea what you're doing," Blackstone said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're destroying this company and everyone's jobs with your wild accusations." David felt a surge of courage unlike anything he'd experienced before. This wasn't just about his salary cut anymore. It was about justice for everyone in that room who had been manipulated and deceived. "The only person destroying this company is you, Mr. Blackstone, and the evidence in this folder proves it beyond any shadow of a doubt." He opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a complex financial statement that showed money being funneled through a series of shell companies. This payment, for example, $2 million to Phoenix Consulting Solutions for strategic advisory services. The problem is, Phoenix Consulting Solutions doesn't exist. It's a shell company created specifically to siphon money out of Nexus Technologies. The murmurs in the room grew louder as employees began to understand the implications of what David was revealing. Amy stepped forward from the crowd, her face set with determination. "I can confirm that," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "I processed those invoices myself. When I tried to contact Phoenix Consulting to verify the services, the phone number was disconnected and the address was a vacant lot." Gloria Martinez looked like she was about to faint. Beads of sweat had formed on her forehead, and her hands were shaking as she reached for her phone. David realized she was probably trying to contact the company's legal team, but it was too late for damage control. "There's more," David continued, pulling out another document. "Inflated supplier contracts, phantom employee bonuses that were never distributed, and a complex web of financial manipulation designed to enrich senior management while systematically underpaying the workforce." Blackstone was no longer trying to maintain his composure. "This is corporate sabotage," he snarled. "You're making wild accusations based on documents you had no authorization to access." "Documents I accessed as part of my job responsibilities," David corrected. "Documents that every employee in this room helped generate through their hard work and dedication, work that was being used to facilitate fraud while you cut their salaries and planned to eliminate their jobs." The room had fallen into a tense silence, broken only by the sound of people shifting in their chairs and the distant hum of the ventilation system. David could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. This moment would define not just his future, but the future of everyone in that room. "The question now," David said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "is what we're going to do about it." The answer came from an unexpected source. Tony Rodriguez, a maintenance worker who had been with the company for 12 years, stepped forward from the back of the room. His work clothes were stained with oil, and his hands were calloused from years of manual labor, but his voice was clear and strong. "I've been fixing the broken things in this building for over a decade," Tony said, "but I can't fix what's broken in this company's leadership. I'm calling the FBI." He pulled out his phone and began dialing. Blackstone lunged toward him, but Amy and several other employees immediately formed a human barrier, protecting Tony as he made his call. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, I'd like to report corporate fraud at Nexus Technologies." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity that would be remembered in local business circles for years to come. Federal agents arrived within 30 minutes, armed with search warrants and accompanied by forensic accountants who began systematically examining every financial record in the building. David found himself at the center of a media storm that erupted when news of the investigation leaked to local reporters. Camera crews gathered outside the building, and his phone buzzed constantly with calls from journalists wanting to interview the whistleblower who brought down a corrupt corporation. But the real satisfaction came from watching his colleagues, people he'd worked alongside for years, finally getting the respect and recognition they deserved. The FBI agents treated the employees as valuable witnesses rather than potential criminals, carefully documenting their testimonies and ensuring their protection from any potential retaliation. Amy emerged as a crucial witness, her meticulous record-keeping and sharp memory providing investigators with a detailed timeline of the company's fraudulent activities. Tony Rodriguez became something of a folk hero, his simple declaration of principle resonating with workers across the city who had suffered under similar circumstances. As the investigation unfolded over the following weeks, the scope of Blackstone's crimes became clear. The fraud extended far beyond simple embezzlement. He had been systematically looting the company's pension fund, manipulating stock prices, and even filing false tax returns to maximize his personal profits. The salary cuts that had seemed so personal and vindictive were revealed to be part of a larger scheme to destabilize the company's finances, making it easier to hide the missing money. Blackstone had planned to declare bankruptcy within 6 months, walking away with millions while leaving his employees with nothing. 3 months after that fateful morning in the conference room, David stood in the lobby of the newly renamed Phoenix Technologies. The company's board had chosen the name as a symbol of rebirth from the ashes of corruption. The federal investigation had resulted in criminal charges against Blackstone and several other senior executives, while also recovering enough stolen money to restore full salaries and benefits to all employees. David had been promoted to Chief Financial Officer, a position that came with both increased responsibility and the opportunity to build the kind of ethical financial practices he'd always believed in. More importantly, the company had implemented new transparency policies that gave employees unprecedented access to financial information and decision-making processes. Susan and Emma had returned home the week before, and David felt like he was meeting his family again for the first time in months. The stress lines around his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing he'd done the right thing when it mattered most. "Dad," Emma said one evening as they worked on her math homework together, "my teacher says you're a hero." David smiled, thinking about all the people who had shown real courage during those dark months. Amy with her unwavering loyalty, Tony with his simple declaration of principle, and dozens of other employees who had chosen to stand up rather than give up. Heroes are just ordinary people who decide to do the right thing when it's scary, he told his daughter. And sometimes the scariest thing is standing up to bullies. 6 months later, David received a letter from the U.S. Attorney's office informing him that Blackstone had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to his victims. The letter thanked him for his courage in exposing the fraud and noted that his actions had prevented hundreds of families from losing their life savings. But the letter that meant the most came from Tony Rodriguez, who had been promoted to facilities manager and was taking night classes to earn his business degree. It was short and simple. "Thank you for showing us that one person can make a difference. My kids are proud of their dad now." As David read the letter in his office, the same office where Blackstone had once intimidated him with threats and corporate doublespeak, he reflected on how a single moment of courage had changed not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. The salary cut that had seemed like the end of his career had actually been the beginning of something much more important. The story of David Chen and Nexus Technologies became a case study in business schools and a cautionary tale in corporate boardrooms across the country. It showed that even in an era of corporate power and employee vulnerability, truth and justice could still prevail when ordinary people found the courage to stand up against corruption. Years later, when young employees asked David for advice about dealing with workplace injustice, he would tell them about that morning in Conference Room B when he decided to fight back instead of giving up. He would remind them that every person has the power to make a difference, but only if they're willing to risk something in pursuit of what's right. The fluorescent lights still hummed overhead in the offices of Phoenix Technologies, but now they illuminated a workplace built on transparency, respect, and the simple principle that no one should have to choose between their integrity and their livelihood. And if you found this story as inspiring as we did, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing it with others who might need to hear that standing up for what's right is always worth the risk. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or wealth, but with the simple courage to tell the truth when everyone else is afraid to speak.